Okay, so this is Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. The figurehead that is worshipped by citizens of the society is Ford, as he is looked at as a god by everyone who was civilized, because he was the person who started the process of creating people. Brave New World. And so the essential question here is, better to be happy or free? And there is Brave New World. Chapter 1. A squat gray building of only 34 stories. Over the main entrance, the words Central London, Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and in a shield, the world's state motto, Community, Identity, Stability. So this is the setting and the conflict. Both of those are set up. The enormous room on the ground floor faced toward the north. Cold for all the summer beyond the panes, for all the tropical heat of the room itself, a harsh, thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic gooseflesh, but finding only the glass and nickel, bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Cut it out, Harry. Wintriness responded to wintriness. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale corpse-color rubber. The light was frozen dead, a ghost. Only from the yellow barrels of the microscopics did it borrow a certain rich and living substance, lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak, in long recession down the work tables. And this, said the director, opening the door, is the fertilizing room. Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged as the director of Hatcheries and Conditioning entered the room. In the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded soliloquizing hum or whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young, pink, and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels. Each of them carried a notebook in which, wherever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled. Straight from the horse's mouth. It was a rare privilege. The D.H.C. for Central London always made a point of personally conducting his new students round the various departments. Just to give you a general idea, he would explain to them, for of course some sort of general idea they must have if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one if they were to be good and happy members of society as possible. For particulars, as everyone knows, make for virtue and happiness, generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers, but Fret Sawyers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. Tomorrow, he would add, smiling at them with a slightly menacing geniality, you'll be settling down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege. Straight from the horse's mouth onto the notebook, the boys scribbled like mad. Tall and rather thin but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big, rather prominent teeth. Harry, just covered, when he was not talking, by his full, floridly curved lips. Old, young, 30, 50, 55, it was hard to say. And anyhow, the question didn't arise in this year of stability, AF 632. It didn't occur to you to ask it. I shall begin at the beginning. I shall begin at the beginning, said the D.H.C. So D.H.C. is a character, and the more zealous students recorded his intention in their notebooks. Begin at the beginning. These, he waved his hand, are the incubators, and opening an insulated door, he showed them rack upon rack, racks upon racks of numbered test tubes. The week's supply of ova, kept, he explained, at the blood heat, where the male gametes, and here he opened another door. They have to be kept at 35 instead of 37. Full blood heat sterilizers. Rams wrapped in thermogene beget no lambs. Harry, drive me nuts. Still leaning against the incubators, he gave them, while the pencils scurried illegibly across the pages, a brief description of the modern fertilizing process. Spoke first, of course, of its surgical introduction, the operation undergone voluntarily for the good of society, not to mention the fact that it carries a bonus amount to 6 months' salary. Continued with some account of the technique for preserving the excised ovary alive and actively developing, passed on to a consideration of optimum temperature, salinity, viscosity, referred to the liquor in which the detached and ripened eggs were kept, and, leading his charges to work the tables, accurately showed them how this liquor was drawn off from the test tubes, how it was let out by drop by drop, onto the specifically warm sides of the microscopes, how the eggs which it contained were inspected for abnormalities, counted and transferred to a porous receptacle, and how and he now took them to watch the operation. This receptacle was immersed in a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermatoza at a minimum concentration of 100,000 per cubic centimeter, he insisted, and how, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the liquor and its contents re-examined, how, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and, if necessary, yet again, how the fertilized ova went back into the incubators, where the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while the gammas, deltas, and epsilons were brought out again after only 36 hours to undergo Bokanovski's process. Bokanovski's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. 1 egg, 1 embryo, 1 adult, normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. Progress. So as you look at the repetition here and what he's trying to say, this paragraph is unique in both writing style and content. Essentially, the D.H.C. concluded, Bokanovskification consists of a series of arrests of development. We check the normal growth, and paradoxically enough, the egg responds by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed. On a very slowly moving band, a rack full of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rack full was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard x-rays being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into two. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to the incubators, where the buds began to develop. Then, after 2 days, were suddenly chilled, and checked. 2, 4, 8. The buds, in their turn, budded, and having budded, were dosed almost to death with alcohol. Consequently, burgeoned again, and having budded, bud, were thereafter, further arrest being generally fatal, left to develop in peace, by which time the original egg was in a fair way to becoming anything from 8 to 96 embryos, a prodigious improvement, you will agree, on nature. Identical twins, but not in piddling 2s and 3s as in the old viviparous days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide, actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores, the director repeated and flung out his arms as though he were disrupting largesse. Scores. But one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. My good boy, the director wheeled sharply around on him. Can't you see? Can't you see? He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bokanovski's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Major instruments of social stability. Standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory staffed with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voice was almost tremulous with enthusiasm. You know where you are for the first time, and you really know where you are for the first time in history. He quoted the planetary motto, community, identity, stability, grand words. If we could Bokanovskify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons, millions of identical twins, the principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head. We can't Bokanovskify indefinitely. 96 seemed to be the limit, 72 a good average. From the same ovary with gametes of the same male to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible. That was the best, sadly a second best, that they could do, and even that was difficult. For in nature it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity, but our business is to stabilize the population at this moment, here and now. Dribbling out twins over a quarter of a century, what would be the use of that? Obviously no use at all, but Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 150 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and Bokanovskify, in other words, multiply by 72, and you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield us over 15,000 adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young man who happened to be passing at the moment, Mr. Foster, he called. The ruddy young man approached. Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster? 16,012 in the center, Mr. Foster replied without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, had a vivacious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012 in 189 batches of identicals. But of course, they've done much better, he rattled on. In some of the tropical centers in Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mombasa has actually touched the 17,000 mark. But then they have unfair advantages. You see, the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary, it's quite astonishing when you're used to working with European material. Still, he added with a laugh, but the light of the combat was in his eyes and the lift of his chin was challenging. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful delta minus ovary at this moment, only just 18 months old. Over 12,700 children already, either decanted or in embryo, and still going strong. We'll beat them yet." "That's the spirit I like," cried the director, and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. "Come along with us and give these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge." Mr. Foster smiled modestly. With pleasure. They went. In the bottling room, it was all harmonious bustle and ordered activity. Flaps of fresh sow's peritoneum, ready cut to the proper size, came shooting up in little lifts from the organ store in the sub-basement. Whiz, and then click. The lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner had only to reach out a hand, take the flap insert, smooth down, and before the lined bottle had time to travel out of reach along the endless band, whiz, click, another flap of peritoneum had shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle for the next of that slow interminable procession on the band. Next to the liners stood the marticulators. The procession advanced one by one. The eggs were transferred from their test tubes to the larger containers. Deftly, the peritoneal lining was